In this video I'm going to discuss, is the Canon EOS M10 any good for vlogging? Well, you can see we've got the standard features. We've got battery at the bottom, we've got a tripod mount, and you could put a plate on the bottom and still get your battery in and out, which is great. On the top we have a very simple interface. We have a jog dial essentially that changes to video, so you can leave it in default video mode, which is great, and that center button you press in to turn it on and it turns on. So to start, very good. You've got a record button that starts recording, and you've got a quick jog dial to change settings or change your aperture, and a button to focus. But you can also do touch focusing on this. So to start with, it has a good layout. You've got a thumb rest to put your thumb on, which is quite comfortable, and you've got very minimal buttons on the back. You've got a menu button, you've got exposure, display change, you've got that button that switches on your lower end Canons from shutter speed to aperture, and you've got a Q button to change your settings. The key thing though is that the screen flips up, and let's face it, that's the key reason you would want to buy this camera, because it's got a really good flip up touchscreen. So we can see here that we've got a touchscreen, and we can press to select the shutter speed, and then we can either move the jog dial up and down, or we can actually touch on the screen to change the settings there. So I've not got a lens attached at the moment because I'm just demoing out the lens, but you can see I can press here and I can move the jog dial on the front very easily to change the ISO, or I can just touch it. And it also has auto ISO, which is really useful. So I can touch the Q setting on the screen, and I can use the screen to go backwards and forwards, or I can use the keys. Either way, I can very quickly and with minimal fuss change my settings. It's not as quick as if I had dedicated buttons like you do on DSLRs and some mirrorless cameras, but I can change the settings quick enough. And really for vlogging, I'm only going to really be worried about changing the aperture setting. You can see here I'm going through the menu, and one of the things I really like is you can change from PAL to NTSC, which means you can do 25 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and we can also record in 24 frames per second. So that's really good. And those are at full HD. You can as well go to 50 and 60 frames per second, but only at 720. But as a default, I shoot at 1080 at 30 frames per second, so I'm happy. There's a self timer, which could be useful for vlogging. And you've got your Canon picture stars, which are still very useful. One of the good things about this camera that you might not get on other ones is you can set custom white balance, which is really useful for video. You don't want your white balance changing with auto. And AF does tracking. It's not the most advanced tracking, but it does do AF tracking, and it does track faces, which is again very useful for vlogging. So on the side, if we flip the screen up, we can very easily get the card out, although it can be a bit difficult. So it takes SD cards, as you'd expect, and you've got your HDMI and your digital out. So I bought the body only, and later I bought a second-hand 18 to 55 lens. Now what's good about this lens is it's actually a very nice construction for a kit lens. It's all metal. It's actually a really nice kit lens, and it has image stabilisation, which is great. So I'm just going to put it on now. Mine, I was quite lucky, mine came with a lens hood. And you could, with this camera setup, take the lens off and you could slip the camera in one pocket and the lens in the other pocket. They're that small. So you can see the lens is quite small. Doesn't stick out too much, but does give a good wide range of covering. And the f-stop goes on this lens from 3.5 to 5.6, I think. One of the key things about the EOS M is that you can use your Canon glass on it. So your Canon EF lenses that you've invested in, if you get an adapter, and I bought a cheap £30 adapter or $30 adapter, you can just use them, and you can still use them with autofocus. So this is a lovely Canon 35mm f2 with image stabilisation, and it looks quite big, but it's not too unwieldy. And with touch focus, it can be, you've got a really good combination there. So this is what a typical vlogging setup would look like. Highly portable, and I can see what I'm doing. So now we're going to test the image stabilisation. So I'm walking along. There are two settings for image stabilisation, 1 and 2, and 1 is for walking, and one is just to stabilise. So I'm walking along with the kit lens with image stabilisation. So I'm actually holding the camera just with my hands, nothing special, not a grip or anything, or a Steadicam or gimbal or anything. And here I've changed to image stabilisation 2, which is supposed to be better for walking, but it seems pretty much the same as image stabilisation 1. And so here I'm doing a typical vlog setup, and you can see it looks fine with the image stabilisation on. This is typical vlogging, and it looks fine. The camera isn't bouncing all over the place, and the footage is usable and clean. So I'm going to test it with a Canon EF lens that doesn't have image stabilisation. I suppose I could have just turned it off, but I decided to see what it's like with the adapter and a Canon EF lens. So I'm using the EFS 24mm, walking along, and it has no image stabilisation. And you can see the footage is not as smooth, and it is not as clean, and it is a bit bouncy. Still, I would say usable though. And again, I'm holding it at waist height without a grip or any other holding device. So now I'm going to test high ISO performance by filming a sheet of white paper. I've started at ISO 400 because I'm quite happy with 100 and 200. ISO 400 was slightly underexposed, but ISO 800 is looking okay. So ISO 800 is perfectly usable. ISO 1600 looks a lot brighter and is quite possibly slightly overexposed, and I still think that's quite usable. ISO 3200 I don't think I'd want to go to. There's quite a lot of noise and grain on ISO 3200. And ISO 6400, while not unusable, I would avoid, in all honesty. Lots of noise and lots of grain, and looking slightly softer. Just to confirm, I've not changed any of the focusing settings or any of the shutter speeds. The only thing that has changed is the ISO value. So in conclusion, is this a good camera for vlogging? Yes, it is. It's relatively cheap. If you've already invested in EF lenses, it's really good. You just need a £30 adapter. And actually, if you buy it with the kit lens is probably going to be good enough for your vlogging needs and gives you a wide range of focal lengths. I would recommend it, and if you look at my future videos on my channel, you'll probably see I'm using it quite extensively. Why don't you consider subscribing to my channel so that you never miss one of my videos. Thanks, goodbye.